Hi, Barry. How are you?
Hi,
Good
I'm
to see
unmuted,
you.
I think.
Yeah, now you're not muted. How are you?
You're good. How was your trip?
Oh, it was fantastic. It was absolutely amazing. I'm just exhausted and jet lagged and trying to get ready for Passover. So all of that has been an interesting week, but it was unbelievable.
Yeah, we're going to leave just a little earlier today because we have an appointment. So we're going to be here
Okay.
most of the meeting. Yeah.
Okay.
Leo, how you doing?
Okay. So it is 12:30, and there are usually a lot more people, Andrew, that join. But I think in the interest of time, it's fair to start. And I will admit people. So don't worry if you see that because you're now a co-host. I will manage that. I might be on My screen might be off, but I'm around. And if you need anything, I'm here. I'll be in and out. And so we're going to get started. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. We are very excited to have Andrew Horwancher with us today, who is the Ernest May Fellow at Harvard and a Wick Carey Associate Professor at Oklahoma. He previously held fellowships at Princeton and Oxford and is the author of 3 books, most recently, The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton with Princeton University Press. So Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you to Laura, to anyone else who was involved with pulling off today. It's always nice to be able to speak to a more intimate audience. And I'm pleased to be able to share this story with you. It brings me a lot of nachas, as we say in the old country. So let's delve in. I'll speak for about 45 minutes and questions for about 15, if that works for folks. Alexander Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a new Jerusalem. After his mother's tragic death, the courts denied him his inheritance, his birthright, and he had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic skills to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of exodus, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't merely similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that Hamilton was himself a Jewish immigrant, and uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Alexander, in all likelihood, had a Jewish identity, I would have to make the case, halachically, that his mother was probably Jewish, and we know that his mother, Rachel, was not born a Jew. So I have to demonstrate the likelihood that his mother converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, St. Croix is part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony, and it is there that Rachel meets and marries Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann was Jewish, that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a non-Jew, still she chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Hamilton scholars have long insisted that Levine is not Jewish because supposedly he's not identified in the Danish land records and census registers as a Jew. The problem is these scholars didn't bother consulting the original Danish source material from the Caribbean. I learned enough Danish to read through these records. I went through 3,000 of them. What did I find? Well, it turns out that these scholars were right. Johann Levine is not identified as a Jew in these records, and that would be problematic for my theory today had I not also uncovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in these records. This is a great example of a piece of evidence that, disaggregated from its context, appears to tell us something about his background, but in actuality is in no way revealing of his religious identity. What else do we know about Johann Levine? Well, we know his name was Levine. His name appears in a variety of spellings, not just Levine, but also Levin, Lewin, Lavian, spellings that match how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. Johann Levine was working as a merchant, a typical Jewish profession at that time. He was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews at a time when Jews conducted business among themselves. He had come from another Caribbean island, Nevis, which was home to a sizable Jewish community. And Hamilton's own grandson explicitly identified Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. So if Johann Levine were in all likelihood Jewish, is it possible that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him? Well, consider this. They have a son a year after their wedding named Peter Levine, who they do not have infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Years later, as an adult, Johann undertakes an adult baptism to join an Anglican church. Well, Anglicans doctrinally practice infant baptism. Why would Anglicans baptize an adult? Well, there's a few possible reasons. One is if the person in question had grown up Christian, but in a non-Trinitarian sect. In other words, if someone had been baptized, but not in the name of the Trinity, not in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Some Christian sects are non-Trinitarian. So Anglicans would accept any Trinitarian baptism as valid, but not a non-Trinitarian one. Could it be that Peter Levine falls into this category? No. There were no non-Trinitarian sects on St. Croix in the years that Peter Levine lived there. Another possibility that would explain why Anglicans would baptize an adult is if the person had grown up in a sect that only does adult baptism, or what's sometimes called believer's baptism. Could it be that Peter Levine grows up Christian, but in a sect that practices adult baptism, he simply hadn't had his adult baptism yet, transitions to the Anglican Church, and he has to be baptized for the first time? Again, the answer is no, it's not a possibility, because there were no churches that practiced adult baptism on St. Croix in these years. The third and final reason why Anglicans would baptize an adult, the only explanation that plausibly pertains to Peter, is if he's converting to Christianity. Now, Hamilton scholars have long been baffled by Peter Levine's adult baptism. They are mired in the assumption that Johann, Rachel, and Peter were cradle-to-grave Christians. If, however, Johann was in all likelihood Jewish and Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, then that would make her son Peter a Jew. And his need for an adult baptism, this long-standing mystery that has baffled Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that's just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Now, Rachel and Johann have a deeply troubled marriage. She has her imprisoned for infidelity, and when she gets out of prison, she absconds from the island of St. Croix, leaving behind Johann and Peter, and she winds up ultimately on the British Caribbean island of Nevis, where she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, James Hamilton is unquestionably a Gentile, but there are compelling reasons to think that that Rachel chooses to raise Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. Now, if Alexander were born Jewish, we would expect that he would be circumcised. If born Christian, baptized. There are no extant circumcision records for any of the Jews that were living on Nevis, unfortunately. There are, however, surviving baptismal records which show no entry for Alexander. And even more compelling than that is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table so they would be eye level, and he would recite to her the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. Now, I didn't discover these facts. Hamilton scholars have long known that there's no surviving baptismal record, They've long known that Hamilton went to this Jewish school. How do they make sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. If he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. It's a very neat and tidy explanation, and one that would be problematic for my thesis today, had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through the church records and found that children on Nevis and indeed throughout the Caribbean were regularly born out of wedlock yet baptized. We have precious little grounds for assuming that Hamilton's illegitimacy posed any obstacle to his participation in church life or goes any way towards explaining his enrollment at a Jewish school. Moreover, Hamilton scholars make a critical error in assuming that a child who was seen as Christian would have attended a school for Jews. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to instill in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to cultivate in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their fellow Jews spread out across the diaspora. And there was a Talmudic prohibition that many people took seriously, that many people interpreted to ban Jews from teaching non-Jews the Torah. And so for all of these reasons, it would be remarkable to find a child who was considered Christian attending a school for Jews. It would be more than remarkable. I have never found in any of my research, nor do I know of any scholar of 18th century Jewish education who has ever uncovered anywhere in the world an example of a Christian child attending a school for Jews in that century. Moreover, Hamilton scholars misunderstand the nature of Jewish-Christian relations on Nevis when they assume that a school for Jews would have taken in a Christian child. And I want to take a few minutes to unpack this part of the argument because it's central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. There were more Jews living on the single Dutch island of Curacao in the Caribbean than in the entire continent of North America. On some of these islands where Hamilton grows up, for instance, it's 25% of the free population is Jewish. Other islands, 40% Jewish, right? These may not be quite Boca Raton numbers, but they're respectable. Why are there so many Jews on these islands? One word, sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for growing sugar, the ultimate cash crop of the 18th century. So lucrative was the Caribbean sugar trade that Britain generated more wealth from its collection of tiny West Indian islands than from any of Britain's North American colonies, indeed, than from all of Britain's North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to choose between giving up one small sugar-producing island in the West Indies or all of Canada. And they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well-positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers willing to stomach some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies stood to profit for that tolerance. And so religious diversity, to the extent that we see it in places like Nevis, it's not celebrated by the British. It is begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of these Jews was always precarious, especially as islands reach peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Jews are often convenient scapegoats. In troubled economic times, Jews' success in commerce was perceived to come at the expense of Christians. Jewish traders are often accused of stealing bread from the mouths of Christian children through supposedly deceptive Jewish trading practices. And this trope, by the way, is perversely ironic because Jewish success was actually predicated on their trustworthiness, on their networks of mutuality with other Jews in a time when credit was scarce, not because of their perfidy with their Christian counterparts. So the geography of Jewish life in Charlestown, which is the main port town on Nevis where Hamilton grows up, That geography underscores how Jews occupy a separate and subordinate rung on the island hierarchy. Jews are not dispersed evenly throughout Charlestown. They are concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter is not the most desirable real estate on the island. It's sandwiched between the jail on one side and a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on the other side. This configuration is telling. Jews in many parts of Europe had long dwelled in their own less desirable districts. And in other words, Jews and Christians are not coming to Nevis and creating a whole new set of social and spatial relationships between the two faith groups. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world. Patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, religious, cultural, and geographic, between Jewish and Christian life. The site of the parish church in Charlestown underscores the staying power of these cultural norms that prize a division between Jews and Christians. In parts of Europe, there are regulations requiring Christians, churches, and synagogues to be built as far from each other as possible. On Nevis, there is no such requirement, and yet they choose to adhere to this convention anyway. Further testimony to the endurance of these mores that sought to segregate Jewish and Christian life. Why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the fraught tenor of the Jewish experience on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that amid this environment, the Jews of Nevis would have educated a child who was considered Christian, unless they considered him one of their own. The stakes for Jews were too high. Their continued residence on Nevis, too doubtful. The politics with their Christian neighbors, too dicey for Jews to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. When Hamilton is around 10, he and his mother leave Nevis and wind up on the Danish island of St. Croix that I mentioned before. Rachel runs a store out of the first floor of a building, and they live together on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple of years until when Hamilton's around 13, his mother falls deathly ill, as does he. They suffer together in a single bed. Alexander pulls back from the brink, but in February of 1768, Rachel Levine takes her dying breath. And the details of her passing and burial may be revealing for our purposes today. Interestingly, Rachel's death is recorded under the name Levine. She had not seen Johann for 18 years, and yet she keeps this surname until her dying day, hinting at a possible abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Rachel, her death is recorded in a church register, which Hamilton scholars have taken to mean, seemingly reasonably, that she must have been a member of that church. But what these scholars haven't countenanced is the possibility that she may be one of many Jews whose deaths were recorded in church registers, because states didn't start keeping civil records of deaths until the 19th century. In the 18th century, state governments are often relying on church records as de facto civil records. And so for this reason, churches are sometimes recording Jewish deaths, particularly in places where there are not enough Jews to have a synagogue with its own records. And indeed, we don't have evidence of a synagogue at this particular time on St. Croix. A number of Hamilton scholars mention that the Christian clergyman presided over Rachel's funeral rites. It's not true. There's no evidence for it. If you look at every Hamilton scholar who makes this claim and you look at their footnotes, every scholar just cites another scholar who makes this claim. It is yet one more myth in the fictions that have shrouded our understanding of Hamilton's early years in kin. Notably, Rachel was not buried in the church cemetery. St. Croix had far fewer Jews than other islands. They didn't have their own cemetery. If you're Jewish, the only option was to be buried at the home of a relative. And in fact, Rachel is buried at her sister's estate. Now, if in all likelihood, Alexander does grow up with a Jewish identity, when does he start identifying as Christian? I suspect any Jewish identity he might have had dies with his mother. He's no longer on Nevis, home to the sizable Jewish community that had educated him. He's on St. Croix, home to a few scattered Jews. His mother's gone. His communal and familial ties to Judaism were severed. A youth as plucky and precocious as Alexander would have been disinclined to compound his troubles as a penniless orphan with a second-class religious status. A recently unearthed court transcript from St. Croix lends credence to my theory that Hamilton was identifying as a Christian by his teenage years, but it also corroborates my theory that he was a newcomer to the Christian faith. So between the ages of 13 and 18, that is from his mother's death until the time he goes to America, Hamilton continues to live on St. Croix as an orphan. And during these years, when he's 17, he's called to give testimony in a trial. And he's on the witness stand assessed for his competency to swear on the New Testament. And the lawyer asks him how he identifies. And he says, well, I'm Anglican. And the lawyer says, so you've taken communion. And Hamilton admits that no, he's never taken communion. And this is a real oddity for someone who's 17. The Book of Common Prayer, which governs Anglican rites, specifies that the paired rituals of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. So the court actually finds that Hamilton has insufficient bona fides as a Christian. It's unusual enough that he's not taking communion that they bar Hamilton from giving sworn testimony. There's one other sidelight from Hamilton's Caribbean teenage years that I want to mention before moving on. Hamilton works in this time as a clerk at an import-export company. When we think about other American founders, they grew up on farms and plantations. They're versed in an agrarian form of economy. Hamilton is growing up in his formative years in the middle of these transatlantic trade networks by dint of working for this trading company in the Caribbean. He is learning on the fly about credit, debt, finance, currency. He is honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future. And thanks to the prominence of Jewish traders in the Caribbean, it's all but certain that Hamilton comes into contact with precisely the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'll later collaborate in building the American financial system. This arrangement continues until August of 1772, when a catastrophic hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. Its eye passes directly over St. Croix. Amid the twin horrors of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders summarily extinguished. The next day, the survivors find strewn amid the rubble the corpses of their neighbors. The best surviving description we have of the storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton, whose description of the storm is published in a local paper, and as legend has it, locals are so taken by his precocious facility with language that they raise money to send him to America for college, and he ends up enrolling at King's College in New York City, what we now call Columbia University, not too far from all of you folks. When Hamilton gets to New York, he does something really interesting. He lies about his age. He tells people that he's born in 1757. But every piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean, including Hamilton's own testimony from the aforementioned court case, puts his year of birth in 1754. Why would Hamilton lie about his age? Well, King's College skews young. The average incoming freshman is only 15. It would be unsurprising if Hamilton, the outsider, the orphan, the West Indian, the immigrant, comes to New York and wants to fit in with the cohort of incoming students. Hamilton is diminutive in stature. He's boyish in face. He looks 3 years younger than he actually is, making the deception that much easier to carry out. So why is this significant for our purposes today? There are two lessons to glean from this anecdote. One, Hamilton was perfectly willing to lie about some elemental aspect of his Caribbean past. And two, even more importantly, he was able to get away with it for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary ever exposing him. What Hamilton probably didn't think through when he gets to New York is that he, once he lies about his age, he has to continue to lie about his age for consistency's sake for the rest of his life. And yet no one ever outs him. Hamilton similarly never breathes a word about a Jewish identity or a Jewish past. In fact, Hamilton didn't really speak about his background at all. And he's able to do so without being exposed. This makes it that much more likely Hamilton could have successfully obscured a Jewish heritage in his American adulthood. Although Hamilton does not identify as Jew or speak of a Jewish background, make no mistake, Hamilton never forgets. No other American founder does more for the cause of American Jewry. But before discussing his relationship with American Jews, I realize that it may seem, before moving on from the genealogical evidence, a little bit outlandish at first glance that a founding father had a secret Jewish identity. There are people in corners of academia who will tell you, poor Wuncher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. But I take comfort in the words of one of Hamilton's rivals, John Adams, who once said famously, facts are stubborn things. So let's briefly take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, came from an island with a Jewish community, conducted business with Jews, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. Rachel marries him, bears him a son. That son is not infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. He later gets an adult baptism under circumstances that only make sense if he's converting to Christianity. She then bears Alexander out of wedlock. There's no baptismal record for him. She enrolls him in a Jewish school when we have every reason to believe Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children. When she dies, it turns out she keeps her Jewish surname until her dying day, and she's not buried in the church cemetery. Later, as a teenager, Hamilton is called to give testimony in a case, and while professing to be Christian, admits that he's never taken communion, which renders him incompetent to swear on the New Testament. And then when Hamilton gets to New York, he proves both willing and able to conceal foundational aspects of his West Indian heritage. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of truth that these people were all cradle to grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. My book proceeds from the foundational premise of all research, which is the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. Now, you might be thinking, poor Wuncher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about a historical figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a bunch of reasons. For one, Hamilton, as I mentioned, maintained a lifelong silence about his Caribbean past, even with his own family. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about his Jewish origins would have been prudent, to say the least. Hamilton scholars have largely followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his origins. Their primary interests are in the extraordinary events of his adulthood. The task of reconstructing the origins of Hamilton's life is not just a recent endeavor or a peripheral endeavor, it's also pretty recent. We didn't know basic facts about Hamilton's upbringing. Something as foundational as his mother's name was unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise then that his religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. What's more, if you want to research Hamilton's adulthood, all of his papers from his American years have been collected, letters, essays, and the like, and published in a 27-volume, the collected works of Alexander Hamilton, available at most any university library. You could write an excellent biography of Hamilton's American years without ever leaving Columbia University's Butler Library. If you want to write about his Caribbean origins, you're talking about documents that are scattered across remote Caribbean islands and the European capitals of the country that colonized those islands. And These documents appear in an astounding array of languages, not just Danish, but also French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch. The painstaking task of reconstructing the esoteric details of Hamilton's youth is hardly worth the onerous effort for the typical Hamilton biographer whose native tongue is English and whose principal interests lie not in the Caribbean, but in the American Revolution or the Constitutional Convention. And so vital facts about even a renowned historical icon remain overlooked for centuries. The notion that we may have missed something major about an American founder shouldn't strike us as terribly remote. Consider by way of analogy, Thomas Jefferson. For 200 years, rumors that he had fathered children with Sally Hemings were lent little to no credence in academic circles until a pioneering scholar, Annette Gordon Reed, who I'm pleased to say, as an aside, blurbed the back cover of my book very generously. Annette Gordon Reed's research in the last generation combined with new DNA testing has led to a new consensus among Jefferson scholars that Jefferson almost certainly did father children with Sally Hemings. By way of comparison, Hamilton's Jewish origins are no less real for having escaped our attention for so long. So this brings us now to Hamilton's adulthood. His support for American Jewry in an era when the cudgel of anti-Semitism was often wielded in mainstream politics is striking, and it assumes a variety of forms. In his role as an influential alumnus of his alma mater, King's College, Hamilton is instrumental in implementing reforms that are friendly to Jews. So after the American Revolution, as the Americans retake New York, they reopen King's College. They decide to rename it. You can't have your alma mater called King's College when you've just rebelled against a monarch, so they rename it Columbia. But he makes a number of other changes. Hamilton is instrumental in doing away with mandatory forms of Christian worship for undergrads. And this is pretty striking given that all the undergrads are Christian. He also changes the eligibility for the college presidency so that Jews are eligible to be president of the college. If you look at other colleges with colonial era roots, including Rutgers or Brown, where I went to school, they don't change their eligibility for their college presidencies to make it open to Jews until the 20th century. Hamilton's 150 years ahead of his time. Hamilton also helped put the first Jew on the board of an American college. We had had higher education in America since the 1630s with the founding of Harvard. Never before had there been a Jew on a college board, and there wouldn't be another Jew on the board of Columbia until the 20th century. And it's a name some of you might know, especially if any of you are lawyers, Benjamin Cardozo, who's more famous as the second Jew ever to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court after Louis Brandeis. Also the second Jew to sit on the Columbia board. He's always the second Jew to do something. He's the Jewish silver medalist, which could be a good title for my next book. So Hamilton implements all of these reforms at Columbia. He's best known, of course, as America's first Treasury Secretary. Washington, in the wake of the ratification of the Constitution, is setting up the new federal government. He taps Hamilton, who's only in his mid-30s, to become Treasury Secretary. If James Madison is the father of the Constitution and George Washington is the father of the country, Hamilton is the father of the federal government. It is his policy agenda more than anyone else's that defines the foundations of the American government upon which the country's future success might well endure. Hamilton sets into motion a grand vision of American finance that is so forward-looking, most of his contemporaries couldn't begin to grasp his prescience. They accuse him of engaging in some dark arts of finance. They believe that he is engaged in some unholy alliance with rapacious Jews, with global, shadowy international networks of Jewish bankers to somehow bilk ordinary citizens and veterans and soil tillers. This is an old anti-Semitic trope that predates Hamilton's era and, as we know, endures into our own day. Despite this opposition, despite the fact that Hamilton's opponents so often try to weaponize anti-Semitism in a bid to derail his policy agenda, Hamilton does not abandon his alliance with the American Jewish community. And it is in Hamilton's legal career that we see most vividly his abiding commitment to civic equality for America's Jews. And I want to share one vignette in particular that captures Hamilton's unique philo-Semitism. Hamilton, with more than 2 years left in Washington's second term, steps down as Treasury Secretary. He's arguably the second most powerful person in the country, and yet he gives it up to go into private legal practice. Why? Well, it was the case at that time, and it's still true to this day, that if you're a talented lawyer, you can make more money working in the private sector than you can working for the government. And so Hamilton gives up his career as Treasury Secretary. He's able to quadruple his salary, goes into private legal practice in New York in the mid-1790s. And in this capacity, he becomes the premier litigator at the New York bar. And he takes on a particular case I want to share with you that is a challenging case, the most challenging case, I would argue, in Hamilton's illustrious legal career. It's a challenging case for a lot of reasons. His client is a Frenchman named Louis Le Guin, who is living in New York City and is accused of fraud in some business transactions. And this at a time when it was widely feared that America and France might be on the brink of war. And so a client from a hostile foreign power is accused of fraud is not the most sympathetic of plaintiffs that Hamilton could have represented. What's more, the opposing party consists of two of New York's most respected businessmen. Those businessmen are represented by none other than Gouverneur Morris, who is not a household name today, but at the time he was one of the most venerated statesmen of the era. He had authored the famous We the People preamble to the US Constitution. He served in the Continental Congress. He was an ambassador representing the Washington administration abroad. And most problematically for Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris could be a devastatingly effective orator in a courtroom. So if all of this were insufficient to persuade you this was the hardest case in Hamilton's legal career, you should also know that Hamilton finds out that his co-counsel is none other than Aaron Burr, and the two of them are not on great terms. And there's one more detail you need to know about this case. Hamilton's principal witnesses are Jews. And this at a time when it was widely and absurdly, erroneously believed that the Jewish religion actually encourages Jews to lie under oath in court. This was an ugly anti-Semitic stereotype with deep roots in European history that had migrated over to the New World. Now, this case slowly gets litigated over a period of years up to the highest tribunal in the state of New York, the Court of Errors. And it's unlike any tribunal we have now because it combines all three branches of government. So the Attorney General, the state senators, and the justices of the state Supreme Court all sit together as a jury, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Now, Gouverneur Morris, in his closing argument, attacks Hamilton's witnesses purely on the basis of their faith. He says flatly, and I quote, "Jews are not to be believed upon oath." He alludes to them as, quote, "these Jew witnesses." Now, the next day, a large crowd gathers in the gallery to see how Hamilton, ever the relentless fighter, will respond. What Hamilton understood was that this case had become about something more than just a dispute between merchants. At stake was the very meaning of the Republic. The question of whether American justice would be blind to religion spoke to the heart of the revolution and its radical promise of equality. The fact that a statesman as esteemed as Gouverneur Morris had resorted to trying to score political points with the court by relying on anti-Semitism, well, it suggested that perhaps the egalitarian rhetoric of the war was little more than a facade, masking discrimination. But Hamilton would not so readily relinquish his dream of equality in the nation he fought to create. In Hamilton's own closing argument, he points to Gouverneur Morris and he says, has he forgotten what this race once were? When under the immediate government of God himself, they were selected as the witnesses of his miracles and charged with the spirit of prophecy. Were not the witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith? Hamilton goes on to say that no one should be judged because of the manner in which they worshiped. In Hamilton's own words, quote, "Be the injured party Jew or Gentile, Christian or pagan, foreign or native, justice clothes him in her mantle, in whose presence all differences of faiths and births, passions and prejudices all are called upon to acknowledge and revere justice's supremacy. It can be all too easy for us from our modern vantage point to overlook the extraordinary character of these remarks. After Jews had suffered the contempt of all ages and nations, here is a founding father demanding that in an American courtroom, a Jew and a Gentile stand equal before the law. Here is where we find the promise of the revolution made real. Here is where we find the radicalism of Alexander Hamilton. When the final tally came in from the Court of Errors by a vote of 28-6 against the odds, Hamilton emerges victorious. Let me say in closing a few words about what I see as the striking parallels between the story of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own. Jewish tradition teaches that Jews were robbed of the land that God had promised Abraham. Amid the resulting diaspora, Jews were outsiders in other societies and civilizations where power was rooted in land. Jews could not own land. Jews had to be intermediaries, tradespeople between societies, people who cultivated linguistic and financial acumen by virtue of their marginality. And for those Jews who made it to America in the early years of the Republic, they held out some faith that this new Republic could be their new Jerusalem. So it was with Alexander Hamilton. He too knew what it meant to live on the margins. He too had developed languages and commercial skills by virtue of his marginality. He too came to America looking for a redemptive homeland. Hamilton once wrote of the Jewish people, quote, "Their progress has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one, that it is the effect of some great providential plan?" Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention in his own unlikely rise from Caribbean orphan to American founder. It was precisely because Hamilton and his Jewish allies were outsiders that they were able to become consummate modernizers. In a world that was largely rural, they flocked to urban life. In a world that was primarily agrarian, they were drawn to trade and commerce. In a world where loyalties often lay with your local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish allies believed in the promise of a unified American nation. It has been said that if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go down to the National Mall. And in fact, I happen to be in Washington, D.C., and the mall is right behind this window. You can go down to the National Mall and you will find carved from white marble a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. But if you want to see a monument to Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the urban, commercial, multilingual, global future that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the American future belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats. It belonged to the itinerant, to the urban, to the enterprising, to the immigrant. It belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish allies. If Jews were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Wow. Has anyone got questions? Leo, you're on mute. Leo, you're on mute. Okay, Leo's on mute and he's talking. Leo? Shame he's talking away. Leo, you're on mute. Leo, you're on mute.
Unmute. Now
There
you
we
can
go.
hear me. I'm saying this was not the type of lecture that I worked on questions because I was so intensely focused on the description and on the paradigms that I didn't go, my mind didn't wander. I'll think of questions afterwards.
That's fine.
But you spoke with incredible passion about this guy. Now, I didn't know if you wanted to mention the show. I didn't see the show, but where does this part or support some of your thinking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wrote a piece that anyone could look up online if they want, in a journal called Starting Points. And if you just Google my name, my last name, and Starting Points, it should come up. I have actually a couple different pieces about Hamilton, but one of them is about wisdom from the Hamilton musical. And what I think Lin-Manuel Miranda does so brilliantly in that show is tie Hamilton's upbringing to later parts of his life. So the first number in the musical is all about Hamilton's Caribbean upbringing, not the Jewish piece of it, but my book wasn't out yet, so he can be forgiven. But it talks about his Caribbean upbringing. And then if you look closely at the lyrics throughout the rest of the show, Miranda's often hearkening back to Hamilton's childhood as a way of trying to understand his adulthood. And I think in some respects, the musical does this much better than a lot of Hamilton biographies. Biography in general tends to give short shrift to upbringing and fixates on adulthood, not connecting the two. But any child psychologist anywhere in the country will tell you that if you want to understand anything about someone's adulthood, you got to know about the first 10 years of their life. So I hope that my book, I don't want to be comparing myself to Lin-Manuel Miranda, but my aspiration is that my book, like his musical, can help highlight for people the importance of childhood as a way of trying to make sense of all the decades to follow. So I really appreciate your kind words, Leo.
Well, do you think that Miranda, after reading your book, would say, "I can go with that. I can handle your."
I think if anyone is well equipped to reimagine the story of an American founder with a broader, more inclusive vision, one that incorporates not just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, surely it is Lin-Manuel Miranda. And in fact, Miranda is from Washington Heights, which is home to Yeshiva University, which helps sponsor some of my research. And Miranda has an honorary degree from Yeshiva University. And as I understand it, he's a big fan of Fiddler on the Roof. And so I think he's someone who knows a lot about Jewish culture, and I suspect would react well. I did have a chance to briefly speak to him actually before his musical debuted, when it was in previews. And I got to chat with him very briefly after one of his preview shows, which I sort of wandered into before it became this huge phenomenon. And he was very kind and encouraging. So I think my publisher did send his agent a copy to forward to him. Whether he's picked it up or not, I don't know.
One other fast
And then
thing.
I see Jill has her hand up. So Leo, after you.
Okay, I'll sign off on that. Thank you.
No, that's fine. Okay.
It was
Jill?
just wonderful. And I do agree with Leo that I don't have a question. I do have a thought though. And I just wondered, I had a while back read the book by Chernow on Hamilton, the book that was the origin for the show. And I just wondered if you've ever had a chance to speak to Chernow, because there was nothing in the book that really suggested any Jewish connection for Hamilton. And I wondered what he would say in a conversation with you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is I'm not sure, but I could offer some reasoned speculation. Chernow's book is a great book. It's been called the single best volume on Hamilton's whole life, and that's probably right. My book is not a comprehensive biography on Hamilton. It's really focused on the Jewish angle. And as good as that book is, I think it does have some blind spots, and the Jewish piece of it is a blind spot. To be fair to Chernow, I don't think he's alone in overlooking Hamilton's Jewish origins. There are dozens and dozens of Hamilton biographies that have been published over the generations, and my book was the first to really engage seriously with the question of Hamilton's Jewish identity. Chernow, I've never met Chernow. You know, Chernow is not a professor, which is not a character flaw, but what tends to be the case is that people who write history who are professors, you know, we're in academia, we go to the same conferences, we tend to know each other. And folks like Chernow, who's not an academic, sort of exists in his own orbit. So I haven't actually interacted with him. He did give a lecture on another topic, and someone I knew happened to be in the audience and was texting me live from it because someone during the Q&A had asked him about me and my research. And this was before my book came out. And he said, you know, I've heard of this guy, Porwancher. I am open to being persuaded in view of compelling evidence. So he very reasonably, having not read the book, wasn't willing to assent to the views, but didn't dismiss them out of hand. And I think that's all you can really ask for. I wrote this book with the open-minded skeptic in mind, whether that's Chernow or whether that's any of you. And I think that the fact that Chernow, instead of sort of swatting me away, said he's open to being persuaded if the evidence is compelling, is a mark of his caliber as a historian. So thanks very much for your question, Joel.
Thank you.
Now, he's.
Oh, Leo, you're on mute.
Hamilton is buried right at Trinity Church.
Correct.
Did you derive any type of input from the burial ceremony or anything on his death that would reflect on what your thesis is?
Sure. Well, you know, my claim is that Hamilton is identifying as Christian.
Yes.
Starting in his teenage years until his death. So it makes perfect sense that he would be buried at Trinity Church. What's really interesting is that if you look through the communion books at Trinity Church, his wife's name appears, but Hamilton never appears. Hamilton doesn't actually join the church. He never actually joins any church. And when he duels against Aaron Burr, at that point, he still had never taken communion. Hamilton maintains a measured distance from church life throughout his adulthood. And it is striking to me, many people suggest that, you know, Hamilton was not that engaged with Christianity for this reason or that reason, but they don't really countenance the possibility that perhaps Hamilton wasn't that engaged with organized Christian life because he was actually harboring this secret Jewish identity. And so I think we need to take seriously the idea that Hamilton, while nominally a Christian, while buried at Trinity Church, his wife's church, that his distance from Christianity is itself an index of perhaps some residue of a Jewish heritage in his Caribbean years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Questions? Wow, that was incredible. Sure. I agree with Leo. There's a lot of, it was just so powerful, just listening to it. It was incredible. Such a great perspective, that so wonderful. I really think that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. And,
okay,
and if
anyone else
have any questions after the fact, feel free to email me. You go to my website, andrewporwancher.com. It has my email address. So don't hesitate to reach out if anything occurs to you after we sign off.
Okay, excellent.
Great.
Thank
you. It's wonderful.
All right, everybody have a Chag Sameach and a happy Passover, and we will see you next week. Okay.
Thank you.
We don't have class next week. There's nothing next week. We'll see you May 5th. All right, everyone. Take care. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.